I think my sound is working, so I'll just give it 1 or 2 more seconds. Thank you all for attending. I saw the panel that was here before and like the qualifications on deck. I'm like, all right, I've got to go after that. I'm going to see how I go. But one thing I'll say is I actually think a lot of the questions that were being asked, we're dealing with non-deterministic systems where we're looking at things like qualitative versus, how well the answers are actually going to be. And I think when we're looking at this, we're trying to apply and evaluate these systems, and for anyone who's been in the machine learning journey for a while, where we've had very good, strict ways of evaluating old models, and then we come into a lot of the new world, and we're really trying to assess what's the best way that we can actually, put systems into production, assess that they're going to be good. I heard human in the loop there, and I think there'll be a few themes like that in this talk. So without further ado, today's talk is Beyond LLMs, Maturing RAG Use Cases. Now, I think before I go into my talk, and maybe to wake people up a little bit after we've all had the lunch and the glucose drop that's come through, we're all aware that like LLMs and GenAI are going to eat the world. And recently, I think, we saw that about 4 weeks ago, someone asked what should have been a fairly innocuous and simple question to a lot of the major LLMs, and a lot of them failed abysmally, and that was, how many R's are in the word strawberry? And we're talking like what is it? OpenAI, the valuation was something like $80 billion. And we've got execs who are wanting to put these solutions, get rid of their analytics team, get rid of the data pipelines. We want these things to answer every question we've got. And that was a simple question that tripped them up. And it exposed the sort of tokenistic way that they can answer questions. If they detect that it's a coding problem, they'll write a little script behind the scenes and they'll try and hide that from you. But I think that was a bit of a Wizard of Oz moment where there was a curtain where it was like, actually, these things aren't actually doing complex reasoning behind the scenes. Then I think it was about a week and a half ago, OpenAI came out and they said, no, we've got our new model. We can reason at the level of a PhD candidate. We can solve the strawberry problem. Now, again, going back to that sort of testing world, before I joined Vendorland, I was a coder for about 15 years. I wrote a lot of unit tests, testing all sorts of interesting edge cases. And I thought to myself, all right, let's see. And this was the first question I wrote. And I'm glad I took a screenshot of it. I didn't know I was going to use it in the talk, but I took a screenshot and I'll replay. My question was, if I was playing Scrabble and I had 2 R's, how many R's would I have if I was thinking about the word strawberry? And it went away and it reasoned. And it reasoned for about 19 seconds. And the response was, in the word strawberry, there are 3-letter R's. Since you already have 2 R tiles in Scrabble and are thinking about forming the word strawberry, you would have 3 R's. The 2 you possess plus consideration of the 3rd R. So yeah, it's PhD reasoning, but fundamentally the answer is completely wrong. And you could imagine if you had a structured output where you weren't just doing like English language responses, but you said structured in JSON, and I want my systems to build off this, and I want intelligent actions, like the level of trust kind of drops quite a bit. And I think that's something to sort of think about as we go through. These systems are getting better, but there's still gaps and they're still not going to be perfect. The next one's quite interesting, and this is unrelated to RAG, but it was also something, we all know, anyone who's got kids, it's going to be hard to stop them using LLMs when they're actually trying to answer their school assignments. I know like teachers are just probably going like, all these assignments are perfect and yet my students are failing their exams as they go through. So a university was interested to see if we've got 3 different teams and we want to give them a Fortran coding assignment. Fortran's an old language, none of them had experience, how are they going to go? And they divide them up into 3 teams. One team was able to use ChatGPT, one team had a Llama-assisted Copilot, and the other team had good old Google search, where they had to actually run the searches. I think maybe they had Stack Overflow as well. Now, in terms of delivery, how did they go? No, let's get the clicker going. All right, there we are. So in terms of how they went, it's no surprise. The team who had ChatGPT, they delivered first. The Llama-assisted Copilot, they delivered second. And then the Google search team, they came in third. And again, it reinforces the idea, and it's no surprise that if you're using LLMs in your daily work, you're probably going to be more productive. But there's a side benefit that you're not getting, which was afterwards they tested the students, where they wanted to test their recall in terms of the solution they put forward, as well as their understanding that they got from doing the assignment with Fortran. And you can see there that the students use ChatGPT, and I think we've all had that where we're using LLMs, they get us through, but if someone asks you at the end of the week, what did you do, what was, like, your recall is not going to be as good. Whereas in the olden days, we used to read blogs on things, we might find that forum post that has one answer without context, and we really have to think about it, synthesize a result, and put a response through. So I think that's just a nice aside before we get into the main talk. So I think, look, I'll do a quick overview on Vectara. I'm trying not to be too pitchy. Peter advised me on the day, he said, this is not a pitch. So I'll just quickly say what we do, and then we'll get to the actual maturing part of Vectara. So look, we're a company, we were started in 2020. We've been working with semantic retrieval systems since about 2019. We've got two ex-Googlers who are our founders. Amin Ahmad, he produced a research paper which was to evaluate semantic retrieval systems. That was then used in the BIA 2020 benchmark. We've also had Ahmadallah, who will actually be speaking at our Melbourne and Auckland event. He joined, he's ex-Cloudera. I actually knew him from back then. He was always like the geeky founder who, at any big corporate events, he wasn't sort of hubbubbing with all the sales guys, he was off flying drones on the site. So very happy to have him as well. Our sort of value prop is we believe that every app will soon be powered by GenAI. I don't think that's a controversial statement nowadays. And what we're aiming to do is try and actually solve it for the enterprise. And that is really just to produce trusted models, make it easy, and all those extra concerns. And today's talk will be, even if you have, whether it's do-it-yourself or Vectara, what are the things you can do as you're building an applications to help you get to production and de-risk yourself? We've got a nice sort of cohort of customers. My partner and I have been at that desk. We've been covering, we're still quite young. We've just had our Series A funding that's gone through, but Nadal and I are actually covering most of Middle East and APAC. So our sleep has been a bit weird for a while. Thankfully, we got our Series A funding and we can hire a few more people. So Nadal and I can focus more on this region. But yeah, it's been an interesting journey. And then everyone else is sort of over in the US, as well as some developers in, I think it's over we've got some in Pakistan. We've got our product manager in Berlin. So yeah, it's a true sort of modern world. There's a lot of screen time in my daily life as we go through. So all right, so LLMs by themselves, there are some issues. Again, it's not very controversial that we can use RAG to help solve some problems. Things like newly arriving data, that can help with LLMs that might have been trained at a certain time. You don't want to necessarily do like a fine-tuning event every single month or every single week as you go through. With RAG, we can also work with things like bias and copyright and citations that come through. So again, it's not very controversial. But what I've been finding over the last year of working with clients is that you still need a lot of enterprise rigor to solve enterprise problems. Even just qualifying out from some asks that you get from business execs. We've had a few times where they say, can we just point to our data warehouse and you'll answer all our questions for us? We can essentially scrap our data engineering and our data warehouse team. So we'll often say, no, we're not going to do that. We don't want the strawberry problem at a much bigger scale as we go through. But what we'll say is that we can take your presentation layer, your gold level sort of business aggregates, put them into Vectara, and we can give you that sort of information as we go through. In terms of a platform, so again, we provide an end-to-end platform for RAG, which is all the way from extraction and encoding of documents and indexing. We can take, JSON, which is structured in a format that's closer to the embedding model, but we can also work with binary. We have a first-class retrieval system and re-ranker. We generate responses. And that last phase, which I'll quickly circle on, is about, the protection from hallucinations. So we provide a hallucination evaluation model, which will actually look at the question and the responses that came in the RAG summary and actually give you an evaluation of whether or not you hallucinated. And this is something that you can put into your API. And going back to the panel where they were talking about, well, how can we be sure that this system's actually providing good, trustworthy answers? This is a nice little side score that you can use. If you build an application with Vectara that's using us on the back end, you can have that score coming through and sort of monitor your use case in production to see how is it actually going. Are the hallucinations getting worse? Do we need to go and have a look at the data that's actually in there? Quickly going through the models that we've got our retrieval model, Boomerang. This was one of the first models we brought to market. It's a best of breed embedding model. It's particularly strong with cross-lingual. We've got our re-ranker model, that's Slingshot. So after the retrieval phase, we've got our re-ranker. Again, it's also cross-lingual as well, over 100 languages in there. Both of those models are designed to be low latency. So where we sit at Vectara, we sit after the data engineering where we want to actually deliver an operational use case. And that might be to an agentic use case. It could just be a basic QA as we go through. But for those use cases, you need a low latency system, and that's where we sort of angled ourselves. With our Series A funding, we released Mockingbird. That's an LLM that's been tuned specifically for RAG. And then finally, we've got, as I mentioned before, the Huey's hallucination evaluation model. We also maintain a benchmarking rank where we actually go through all the major LLMs and we actually rank them and we keep the chart up to date week to week, where we actually evaluate them based on the hallucinations they provide. So that score by itself has been a very useful measure for anyone who's looking at different LLMs and options that you might use in production, where you want to try and evaluate whether or not these things are actually going to give you trustworthy responses. And I think one thing which it's very easy for a vendor to say, oh no, we can get rid of all hallucinations. That will never be true, like for any LLM. Because of the way they compress data, like the maximum compression you'll get for data is about 90%. These things have a compression ratio, that's measured in like the thousands of percents, where you have to lose fidelity of data when you're giving responses. You'll never be able to get rid of hallucinations from LLMs. There's always going to be a small degree, and it's worth considering in any use case you put to production. A typical application, we've got our data ingest. This is where we'll work with data engineers, and a lot of the topic I'll be talking through later today is around corpus modeling. So that's where, how do you structure your data to best answer your questions? That's where we sort of, I came from Cloudera and Databricks. I think the data engineering and the corpus modeling sort of approach are a bit intertwined. And then on the other side, you've got your application. And I think one of the takeaways, before I went to sort of more of like an OLAP focus working with back-end technologies, I think there was parallels here to when NoSQL came about. And it pivoted. Anyone who's worked with databases for a while, with DBAs who used to be very protective of their domain model, and when people would try and query it, they'd say, well, that's not a concern of mine. My concern is reducing any redundancy in the data. It's the perfect domain model. Whereas what I'm finding is that it's been a pivot again, where we are with our corpuses that we put out, these corpuses should be set up to answer specific questions, and you might have specific structuring for types of questions that you want to do. And I think GraphRag is an example of that, where that's an extension which is structuring data in a way which is best to answer a type of question that you may have. So this is the main part of the talk. That's the pitch done, so thank you for putting up with that. So this is on maturing RAG use cases. Now, there's a few high-level activities that I'll walk through now. These are some that I've seen sort of recurring when I work with clients. It sounds obvious, but question identification. Too often we have execs who say, I want GenAI, we want it to do something, but we're not sure what. You get in there, and then they're sort of like, no, we're not sure we're getting value from it. So I'll touch a bit on question identification. For any data engineer in the room, when you're putting a use case through and you get asked to do the task, one of the first things you do is, where is the data now? How can I get it? So we'll touch on a bit of that. The third one is, and again, this term corpus modeling, I used to think I was a little bit dyslexic as a child because I'd just put words together that I thought worked. I've not heard that before. It probably is a term, and from the expert panel that was here before, they might have another term for it. But I think corpus modeling, data modeling from like the data warehouse space, look, we work with corpuses as they go through, and aligning the structure of the data to the queries, it seems to work. So hopefully in like a year or two, I hear that someone else is saying, oh, corpus modeling, do you know how to do it? I've got this certification. I'll be like, oh, cool, that's great. But we'll see, it might die out, that term. The next one is prompt guardrails. And we've had a few instances where we're working with clients where you kind of know the sector or vertical they're working in. We've had a few clients in the Middle East who there are topics that they will not want their chatbot to answer, and you put prompt guardrails in. And so it's trying to identify what are some questions or areas you want to avoid, as well as what do you want to try and target. And putting that in to any application you're building can actually save your baking when you're demoing to an exec and they try it, live, and they try and see if it will answer a question that it really shouldn't. And it saved us a few times when we put that thinking in. The next one is testing and evaluation of responses. So on the panel there, I think what's interesting is, again, going back to development background, I think there's approaches, bringing the humans back in to actually help test these systems that can work, and I'll touch a bit on that. And then finally, the last two will be feedback loops. When you put these applications out into production, how can you grab the feedback to actually help you improve the system or identify where it's going wrong? And finally, agentic tiers. So that'll be the next sort of part of this talk. All right, so question identification. What will the system respond to? So I think, when you're looking at question identification and what it will respond to, you just align to the use case. Hopefully that's already been defined at the high level. We talked about what questions not to answer. That helps drive the prompt guardrails down below. Getting the business to define just a few basic questions can help a hell of a lot. And what you can do is, even just from those few questions, you could pass that to an LLM and say, generate the rest of the questions. Here's some example documents. Try and generate a few more that are styled like this. And that can help. It might get business off the bench. Even if they want to only give you 5 questions, you might be able to get 20 out that still seem pretty reasonable. Who's going to evaluate them? It's business. They have to be involved. You have to bring in SMEs. You can't. It's a mistake to put a use case through to production without having business at least somewhere involved in the process. The serving tier becomes important, because when you're shifting from the back-end data coming through and you're thinking more about, I've got an application which is now running in production, how am I going to not just answer the natural language query that comes through, but for example, if someone's asking about their insurance policy, you implicitly know in your operational database, when that person's asking, they have this policy. So insert that filter as some metadata as it comes through. So that also can help too. Integrations with chat interfaces. We've had a lot of requests for things like WhatsApp, MS Teams, and a lot of others. Just knowing those integrations are going to be important, because that will also help you know what are some of the ways you can interact with users as they go through. We have one which is coming through more and more where we're actually using emoticons to rank up and rank down answers on there. So just little things like that, which they sound odd, but it's kind of cool. And the last one is just agentic dreams. And I called it agentic dreams, where I think more and more what we're going to see is you'll have a corpus which is structured to answer certain types of questions, but that same data might be represented in multiple corpora for different types of questions that you actually get as well. And then you'll structure those in a tool and routing registry, which will be used for multiple use cases. So data sources, again, where is the data today? I think another question is, and I find this a lot in organizations, is not so much whether or not you've got the data, but what is going to be the most trustworthy source of it. And if you've got duplicates of data, how are you going to boost up results so that you're favouring those that might be coming, say, from an internal policy team versus something like an internal community forum? If you ingested the community forum data and the policy data and you wanted to make sure the policy data is higher ranked, how are you going to do that? We have mechanisms in Vectara where you can actually attach to numerical measures to the data, and you can essentially boost it up based on that. There's other ways to do it too, and I'll quickly talk through a bit later. The other one, and I've seen this one, and I'm really glad that I spent some time doing data engineering before I went to, first operational in the first part of my career, analytic, back to a bit of sort of the operational side of house. Because for legal style documents, where you might have someone asking a question about how law was 2 years ago, you might need to start actually doing start dates and end dates and implicitly take from the user's query, are you asking about the legislation? Well, there was a start date and then a sunset of it from this period. We need to make sure to actually use a RAG prompt that actually brings the right documents in for that period of time as you go through. And I think that's going to become quite important as well. And it's actually a very tricky problem. When you go to a base model that's just trained on all the data, it won't necessarily know which one to pull in for which time. Data formats is an issue. We handle quite a few binary formats. You might need to actually think about more advanced chunking strategies though, depending on the type of document you're working with, and then in which case we might pass the buck to you in some instances, where instead of just trying to do the binary and the structuring ourselves, we might say, no, you actually might need to do that one. So that is a balance there. And then of course, data granularity. Are you dealing with few documents that have hundreds of pages and you want all that content in at once, or are you dealing with, like, say, wiki pages, which are much smaller, piecemeal, update independently and go through as you. So that's also an issue we've seen. So I'll quickly talk about corpus modeling. And again, I mentioned before, I think there's parallels here between what happened when SQL and NoSQL came through. This is really about looking at the documents and the data you've got, the questions you want to ask, and putting the documents together in a format which is going to best answer the question. So I think, when I've gone through, and I've seen a few different instances where it becomes very specific, you've got your unstructured document problems, which I'll talk through, as well as your database ones. one sort of segue before we go into that, in Vectara, in any document you put through, you can put metadata on it. And I see metadata being used for three main purposes as we go through. The most obvious one is when we filter data in the retrieval stage, and this is for index metadata. And this is used where you might have a corpus which has hundreds of documents, but you just want an answer that is, from, say, the sales team, or is marked as being, as part of the legal team, and you want to subset the document. Or if you had multiple insurance documents in there, you might only want one policy type to come back. So that's a filter type of metadata. Another type is summary, where you might want information that has different types of metadata, but it's relevant to the summarizer as it goes through. So I had a use case where we were working with product information which had manufacturer and model. You might want to limit the search to say just one manufacturer, but then you've got like a product code and you want all those product codes to come through so it knows from the user's prompt which one the summarizer is actually going to use. And without that information, we were seeing an issue where it would actually pull RAG context from the wrong product through there. So I think there's summary information and filters to put through. The last one is just output. This is just informational where downstream of the RAG system you're building, you need, maybe it's a URL, or maybe it's a track back to an image icon you want to appear alongside a result. You might put that in there as well. So onto database content. So on this one, you might be dealing with a database which has quite wide fields. You might be trying to think about how can I structure this data so that someone can run a semantic retrieval. We did some work with an incident database where we're working with incidents that were happening in an organization. The incident database itself needed a bit of data cleaning before we brought the data in, but the question was, which columns do we need to add as metadata and which ones do we want to have good semantic retrieval? This was for a business team who wanted to ask questions of their own incidents in human language and bring back results. So it wasn't going to be an analytical style use case, but they needed to still do some database processing on the data that came through. In terms of query patterns, you're trying to identify from the users, in terms of the structure in the data, are you trying to get, and this is all just about context windows, are the users going to ask data that's going to have few rows but very wide, or a few columns but essentially very deep, or both? And you're going to try and get a few different questions from them to work out how to structure that data as it goes through, which will go into your chunking strategies. If you're dealing with an analytics store, so say it's something like Snowflake and you're pulling in data from there, we often get people trying to pull in all of the, for example, row data, and in which case we tell people no, like you don't want to pull all the row data in for, say, your raw and your silver tables, but you might have some aggregate tables that you do want to pull in. XX just want to quickly ask, what's the latest for blah for a given day as we go through. And these will have implications for chunking strategies, as well as prioritizing latency and throughput. On the document side, so things like ingesting 1,000 documents, you want to look at things like table processing as we go through. There's questions about whether or not you do pre-processing on documents or potentially post-processing further down in the RAG pipeline. Both potentially are applicable for different use cases. Looking at document quality is also very relevant. We've seen the same team say, we just want to put all of our PDFs in there, and when we look inside them, some are really good generated PDFs, some are absolutely awful image PDFs, and it affects the quality, and it comes back to, there's no necessarily one silver bullet, and you might need treatments. We were working with a partner on the solution that was looking at this, and they basically just costed out the solution, because again, they're going to need data engineering, they're going to need to work with the business teams to help improve the data as it goes through, because again, we come back to garbage in, garbage out. We come to another one, which is often when people use natural language, they use keyed fields that might be used in indexing just in their sort of human language as they put through. So show me incident blah, blah, blah. If you solve that purely semantically, it may not return the actual row, the incident that you actually want back. So we've looked at this, and again, one of the benefits of being a small company, I was sort of saying, look, we need something better, and it was coming from a few other field engineers as well. We've put forward something which is called query intelligence for automatic filter selection. So it's kind of like an agentic tier within Vectara. So you define the metadata and description of it. when it looks at the user's query, it's going to identify the best metadata fields to actually help reduce the search. So for example, if someone asked about, say, incident 1234, it's going to apply that filter within the semantic search and then return back the data about that incident. So if you've got 1 million incidents, it's going to very quickly return that result. If you don't do that and try and do just a pure semantic search, the token for the actual ID may not actually match, and it might weight more on something else in the query. So this is a feature that's beta at the moment, and hopefully, the next sort of workshop or two at the DataEng Bytes one in Sydney, I'll be able to sort of talk more about this feature in depth. I'll start going a bit fast because I think about 28 minutes through, but over on prompt guardrails, look, again, if you know the business purpose and you know the kind of topics they want to talk about, it's not hard to just put something like this in, but it does help make your use case a lot more rock solid and avoid any sort of potential pitfalls in the enterprise space. Over on the testing strategies side, so the first one here is you can actually use, and I've used it before, an LLM for evaluation of test responses versus questions. I've seen it work quite well, but I could imagine business not always being happy with that. Like I could imagine situations where business want that control themselves. They're not going to trust an LLM to do it. I still think it might help accelerate some solutions going forward. I think the hallucination evaluation has been useful as well. The fact that you can run a series of queries and at least have some sort of metric that's produced. We give that out of the box. And I'm sure there's other ways to produce something like that if you trained your own model to detect hallucinations. The fact that we've got this working across all the major LLMs in the industry, again, it's something that we deliver, which we think will be useful. In terms of when you get a response that you don't like, there's 4 main areas where this could actually be. You could have bad data. Your retrieval model might not be functioning very well. If you have a re-ranker, that could also be an issue. And then finally, your RAG prompt has returned a good set of information. Your summarizer itself might be sort of missing information. It might be hallucinating. There's 4 main areas. And again, going back to like testing and root cause analysis, getting business to understand that there's a few different areas that they can actually look at is part of the issue. We like to think that we help with most of those, and then customers can mainly focus on their data. And we do benchmark all of our models to make sure they're performing at a high level. We also have query history and evaluation UI. This was an initiative by one of our developers. I'm hoping that we take this to the next level, which is we have a series of test questions that you essentially have against a corpus. So whenever new data comes through, you can click a button and it automatically happens. What this is doing today is you can ask questions and have a series of configs. When you use Vectara, there's a lot of different configurations you can pick from to try and optimize your query as it goes through. And this is a way of putting 2 side by side and going, what's the optimal query tunings that we actually want to do for a particular query? So I'm really liking this as it is. I'd like to take it to the next level and actually get an actual seasoned test harness so that when you bring in, say, that test manager from the enterprise who's going, look, I need to sign off on this solution and make sure it's good, as we shift into that world, we have something for them. So hopefully that will be coming out of the box pretty soon. The last one is feedback loops, where you've put your solution into production. How are we going to gather that? And I mentioned at the start, you might have WhatsApp or a Teams integration. Grabbing emoticons is a very low tasking way of actually getting someone to rate something and actually graduating your sentiment from that. So anything like that is good. Being able to know what to do with it, but it can be used. And we've got some features where if you want to boost up results, we've got custom dimensions as well as a user-defined re-ranker where you can put your own function in. You can take that feedback and use it to essentially boost up results that are coming through. So I'll close out now. So thank you everyone for staying. So some takeaways here. So look, we think RAG with LLMs will be a huge benefit for GenAI. We think it'll be part of the agentic tiers, whether or not we also see features in like graph RAG as well and all that kind of stuff. I do think that using RAG as a methodology is still maturing. So we contribute, something that's essentially off the shelf and easy to use to help people get there. But I do think, and there was a bit of uncertainty on the panel before, and I mirror that this is a field which is evolving very quickly. I think that it's amazing that RAG is something which no one was talking about 2 years ago, and we're already at the point where we're saying that, oh no, that's old school. We're now doing graph RAG, and then we move from here, and it's like, it almost feels like no one knows. In fact, I was talking to someone today, yesterday, one of the speakers, who's written data science books, they were saying that they're actually going to get their kids to do a trade, because that's the safest thing against everything that's actually coming through. But, I do think that there will be things, dealing with the enterprise, you have to put a solution through that's going to last 4 years. So you pick something, it's going to be stable, it's going to work, and then maybe in 4 or 5 years you look at something else. But we think this is going to be a pretty good one for a while. And we think we offer a pretty robust approach. And look, we're Series A, so I'm hoping that the next time we talk, hopefully at next year's Data Bites, we've got some of these offerings that I've talked about in beta, as well as some really new amazing ones coming. So look, thank you all for your time, and enjoy the rest of the day.